I'm currently in the process of building a new PC. At the time of this video, I'm still waiting for my CPU to arrive, but everything else is already assembled. Since I don't know how long that will take, I don't intend to start playing any big games I anticipate would take longer for me to beat than the estimated arrival time of said CPU. But it's a nice opportunity for me to comb through my game library and tackle some smaller titles. I've already done something like this a few years ago and managed to cross off around 60 games from my backlog by either completing them or playing them enough to determine that they weren't worth any more of my time. This might sound like a lot of games, but I have an unreasonably large Steam library filled with hundreds of games that I got with the purchase of bundles. I did this exercise with the use of a website called howlongtobeat.com. This website gives you access to a database of user-reported completion times for pretty much every game ever made. And it also has a handy feature which lets you import a list of games you have currently activated on your Steam account and sort them by the time it takes to complete them. And that's exactly what I did. I went through that list and continued where I left off last time, and I've played 5 games I'll be discussing in this video. These won't be deep dives into each title. Unlike a full review, there's not much to say about these games, either because of their brevity or simplicity. Snakeybus commits the sin of looking far more interesting in its gameplay trailer than it actually turns out to be while playing it. The title neatly encapsulates all this game is. It's the old Nokia phone classic Snake, but in 3D, and instead of a snake you control an ever-elongating bus. You pick up passengers and head towards their destination in order to make the bus longer and thus increase your score. The ability to jump enables you to avoid your own ever-growing body, but there's no actual penalty for colliding with yourself. The only way to lose is by either going out of bounds of the level or by being stuck somewhere without the ability to move. So counter what the game wants to tell you in its trailers, it's not about going fast and maneuvering recklessly. You're far better off taking it slow and making deliberate turns so you don't end up in a cul-de-sac without the ability to move anywhere. Going fast while being airborne also increases your chances of going out of bounds, again disincentivizing fast play. And if this description makes the game sound fairly repetitive and insubstantial, well, that's because it is. The basic idea is neat, but it's underutilized because it's literally just Snake in 3D with a bus. The multiplayer mode seems to somewhat expand this by giving you offensive capabilities to shorten other players' buses, since the goal of that mode is to have the longest bus by the end of the time limit. But I couldn't actually verify it, because by the time I've played it, nobody else seemed to care, so as of now, this is pretty much just a shallow single-player experience. I would have hoped for some actual content here, some challenges to overcome with your increasingly long bus or something, but alas, it's really just the bare minimum of gameplay with a handful of levels. This idea of only providing the bare minimum also seeps into the rest of the game. The menus look extremely utilitarian and bland, and all the UI elements lack a unified style, and the game seems to have a very slippery grasp on controller inputs. While the game is in action, the controls work fine, but in the menus the game frequently simply ignores any input from the controller at all. Stuff like this makes me think back to the very few times I've played games in early access, which typically feature problems like this. This shoddy presentation without any attention to detail makes the final product appear cheap. This, in addition to the lack of content, means that I can't recommend Snakeybus. Desert Child is what I would call a perfect example of style over substance. If you look at the marketing materials and even the first couple of seconds when booting up the game, it definitely has an infectious vibe about it. But this veneer is only tissue thin, because beneath the outward appearance, this really isn't that great of a title. The basic gameplay consists of side-scrolling quote-unquote races. And the reason why I put the word races in quotation marks is because there's really nothing here that a traditional racing game would do. The aim of these races is to shoot stuff, collect money, and finish in first place. Sometimes there are other objectives, such as purposefully losing a race or delivering pizza with the same racing mechanics, but in the end you're just supposed to avoid hazards, shoot stuff, and ideally cross the finish line in first place, because that's what nets you the most money. There is a scoring system that defines the payout by how many targets you've shot during the race and how long you were in first place, but overall it's fairly limited in terms of gameplay. Said gameplay also isn't tied into the narrative at all, which takes place between races in sections where you can freely explore a city on Mars. This mostly serves for you to get rid of the money you earn by buying parts and repairs for your hoverbike and food to still your hunger, and you can also find side jobs besides racing like the aforementioned pizza delivery missions. But again, they're all the same thing gameplay-wise, so it's not like you're doing interesting side activities to supplement the main attraction, it's just more of the same. There's some flashy dialogue whenever you interact with someone, but most of these people are just faceless NPCs, so there isn't a lot of memorability to them. And spending money in the city for parts, repairs or food are meaningless money sinks that ultimately only serve to artificially lengthen the game. Overall, the game loses its charm fairly quickly and becomes a repetitive slog. Repetitive gameplay can work if the primary gameplay loop is satisfying and fun to engage with, but Desert Child is so devoid of any depth regarding its gameplay that it couldn't really sustain my interest for very long, which is why I can't claim to have finished the game. I usually try to get through a game entirely before I discuss it, but I feel that there is worth in giving an opinion only based on limited exposure, because if it's the game's fault that I didn't want to play it any longer, that warrants a negative review. It feels more like it should be some random minigame in some other larger production, not the main attraction, which is why I really can't recommend this game. I have a fondness for puzzle games where the puzzles in question involve thinking about your own perspective and where the spaces around your character you control are part of the puzzles themselves. And four-sided fantasy perfectly fits the bill. It takes the decades-old screen wrap concept of asteroids, wherein you can steer your ship off of one side of your screen and have it reappear on the other side, and remolds it into a neat little puzzle mechanic where the player gets to control the screen wrap at will. In typical puzzle fashion, things start out simple and get ever more complex as the game goes on. So while you're at first only able to simply walk and fall off of one side of the screen and reappear on the other side, over the course of the game, four-sided fantasy also includes an inverted gravity mechanic, some stages where each time you cross the boundaries of your screen your character also reappears on a different depth plane, and finally a section where you have multiple split-screen views between which you can cross over. Since this is such a simple concept, it was wise of the developers to not pad the gameplay with endless repeated bits. They pretty much managed to squeeze out everything you could ask for from this particular game mechanic in an experience that lasts about an hour and change. However, the game itself is purely just a test of skill, since there's absolutely no narrative going on. And I feel like that's kind of a shame. The Steam store page states that the game is about the two characters you get to control, which you switch between every time you cross over the screen's boundaries, but that's just flat out not true. There's absolutely no story going on between these two characters. If you dig a little bit deeper, you may stumble upon the game's Kickstarter page, where the narrative is outlined as being solely about the male character and his quest to find ways to break out of his dull office life. I guess even though the game was successfully funded on Kickstarter, the idea of writing a story for this title wasn't that big of a priority. Aesthetically, the game is mostly serviceable. There are some sections that look great and really manage to set a mood, but others feel inexplicably empty, where entire levels only consist of featureless floors, ceilings and walls with no decorative assets to be seen anywhere. The game also suffers from bugs, especially in the stages that feature the split screen mechanic. Whenever you die during those stages, the screens don't reset, and as such they can block off any and all progress, forcing you to reload the game. The same thing is true whenever you happen to clip through the level geometry during a transition and end up falling forever. There's no way to manually reset any given challenge, and unfortunately reloading means that you'll have to start over the entire section all over again, because the game doesn't save before every single puzzle, only whenever it loads a chunk of puzzles. So if you happen to encounter a bug on the last puzzle of any given batch, you're just out of luck and have to redo the entire thing again. Overall, I want to like this game, and I didn't have that bad of a time playing it, even with the bugs. But at such a short runtime and with so little meat on the bone, it feels more akin to a Flash game than an actual commercial release. And considering that the game is available for $10 if you're not buying it during a sale where by now it's usually heavily discounted, I can't outright recommend it because you can get way more involved games for that price. Voy is exactly what it promises to be, nothing less and nothing more. At its heart, it's basically a tangram puzzle with the added twist that you can overlay all of the shapes and have them cancel each other out if they overlap. It's far easier to show this visually than to try and describe it, but it's still an extremely simple principle to understand. As such, there isn't much to say about the game other than that I enjoyed solving the puzzles. There's little in the way of flair to the game. The entire presentation is as basic as the puzzle mechanic, with simple but clean visuals and a single relaxing background track playing at all times. The game does seem to have a few bugs in there, however. Sometimes when advancing levels, some of the shapes from the previous level remained visible on screen but weren't interactable. Thankfully, the game is so lightweight that you can quit and restart it within a couple of seconds, and the game saves your progress after every puzzle. Still, having to restart the game 4 or 5 times in the span of the hour and change it takes to beat it is not great. I have no idea how this game ended up in my Steam library. I keep a record of every game I purchase, and it seems that I've activated this game on Steam in December 2017. Maybe it was part of a bundle I purchased somewhere and I forgot to put it into my database, but I seriously hope I didn't actually pay any money for this. Am Vegend Zombiegeddon is clearly inspired by Plants vs. Zombies and Angry Birds. And by inspired, I obviously mean that it tries extremely hard to cash in on the popularity of those two games, with as many similarities as it can without constituting straight-up copyright infringement. However, the one thing that made both of those games fun to play was the actual gameplay, and I can't say as much for this game. Am Vegend is in essence a tower defense game where you have to actively get involved in the battles. You can't just plonk down units to defend your seeds and then watch the ensuing battle, you have to manually switch between units and actively engage in combat. While I can certainly see the appeal of this type of gameplay, it just becomes way too hectic eventually, which is clearly on purpose. The game obviously wants you to buy power-ups that either freeze enemies or clear the screen entirely. Not to mention that unit upgrades get rather expensive really fast. Given the fact that there are no microtransactions in this title, and yet it features all the hallmarks of compromised game design to facilitate them, I think it can serve as a perfect example of what microtransactions do in games even by their absence. They impact the game's design insofar as that the game forces you to deal with purpose-built annoyances that you can pay to get rid of. They both artificially slow down player progression while at the same time throwing you a curveball every so often. It's no coincidence that many games funded primarily through microtransactions give you a handful of easy levels at a time while showering you with power-ups, only to then throw in an extremely challenging one where you're forced to use them all up and even buy additional ones. And once those free power-ups are gone, you're much more incentivized to buy some more because, hey, you've already lost your free allotment and you're not going to get it back once you lose the level, so why not invest some money and beat the challenge? It's cheaper than losing the level outright and having to rebuy all the power-ups you'd need to clear the level anyway. The fact that Am Vegend doesn't contain any microtransaction and yet was clearly intended to throws this into very sharp relief. If it wasn't clear until now, I obviously can't recommend enough to stay away from this title. It's a bland mashup of ideas executed with subpar assets and clearly intended for predatory microtransactions. Thank you very much for watching. I know this has been something different than what I usually do, but I like the idea of going through my game library and getting through some titles at a faster pace. If you follow this channel, you know about pretty much every game I've played during this year so far, which is when I genuinely started doing video reviews in a semi-regular manner. And I say semi-regular because I'm aware that my output on YouTube has been rather sporadic, sometimes with as much as 2 months between videos. I've played a few additional games for which I intend to do a separate video all on their own, but those games tend to take quite a bit of time to beat and there are only so many hours in the day I can use for gaming between juggling my job and other responsibilities. And I also haven't forgotten about that Banjo-Kazooie video I promised in my ukulele review. So if you want to see that and maybe some more of these Quickie episodes down the line, why not subscribe to this channel and get notified once those come out?